There you are.
Yeah, Ronnie.
For a second, I was afraid that you were kicked out of Instagram, so I was just double checking. But you're fine.
No, I tested it out earlier. I can still go live, thankfully.
Good. You know, I didn't know you had that issue anyway. That sometimes it's restricted.
Yeah, Instagram's laws when it comes to content moderation could definitely be much better, especially when you're facing an organized reporting campaign almost nonstop.
You know, and this is actually part of the reason why, and just full disclosure, I reached out to you today because I wanted to throw some ideas out with you and flush them out. And I saw that you were attacked relentlessly on Twitter, on social media in general. So you're kind to even let me talk to you when things are probably in your mind, you want to wind down a bit and cool down. I thought we could take advantage of the momentum and build on what's happening. So Gino, I'll just do a quick introduction. Everyone knows who you are, but I'll just plug your BUKRA podcast because I was on it maybe 2 months ago or so, 3 months ago, and I listened to it frequently. And the reason I listened to it is because you ask very peculiar, unusual questions for guests that I've spoken to, and I like the way you actually navigate topics. Sometimes you throw curveballs, which I like. So I'm learning from the way you talk to the people we know. I want to add something. My private conversations with you, and even on our mutual podcast when we host each other, I will say that you are probably among the most engaging and, in my mind, bright individuals I know. And I'll say this because I know you when you're not on Instagram and you're not attacking. You have a way on social media that's not maybe for everyone's, it's not to everyone's liking.
That
So
works, yeah.
I know you in different ways. I know you as a writer. I read your NOWLebanon article, which came out today, actually, about the topic I want to discuss. You've been writing for a long time, and you have a way with words that resonates with me. I'll say also, I am tired of talking for the sake of talking. We both do this regularly. It's not just us. It's the people you go after on social media, in particular one individual. He does this for a living. He talks for the sake of talking. We all do it in different ways, and I think a lot of what we're trying to do is to unpack and explain and understand maybe what's happening, but I think that's fine for a certain period of time. I think that duration expired. And for me, the last 10 days have been quite important. And I'm sorry for this long introduction, but it'll make sense because we haven't spoken really before this.
It's been a while. We had the elections, we had a lot of things going on.
Exactly, and I mean, the last maybe 2 weeks in particular, actually, you know what, since August 4, since the anniversary, the 2nd year anniversary, it's almost surreal that you're walking in a march and you're walking with people you love. And there are hundreds, if not thousands of people that you share this pain with on the streets. And while you're walking from Samir Asir Square to the port, to the statue, the Mukhtar statue, 2 of those silos, the sort of the northern section, they fall. They collapse while we're walking. And the background looks like hell. And in that background, you have the loveliest people still trying to get answers, still believing in the process, still using slogans like justice and impunity and all of that stuff that we know. And yet, if you stretch it over time, the more we talk and the more we scream, the more we shout, the less progress. And the more we understand the topic, the further away we're from an answer. And then it struck me that people I love, that I've come to love in this country in recent years, are now either directly under threat, in hiding, or they're letting go.
Okay.
I mean, I met Hassan Sha'ban just 2 nights ago, and he's free to do whatever he wants with his career and his life. I think he earned it, and I think what he did was profound. Without saying much, he just pointed the finger at the problem. He used very careful words, just maybe 3 photos. And I told him this in person. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. he did exactly what Tariq Bitar did. Without saying much, he showed us
Ronnie,
exactly what the
maybe you
problem.
should remind people who Hassan Shaban is.
You're right.
He's the photojournalist who was attacked by Hezbollah and threatened for covering the water shortage in one of the towns in the south. So it's another message by Hezbollah, shut your mouth, don't protest, accept your living situations, don't make us look bad.
I always forget that in my mind everyone knows everything all the time. You're absolutely right. And do this repeatedly, because I go on tangents.
It's hard to keep track.
Wallah ya zalim, it's so hard to keep track. Because Hassan Shaban to me is now on his own way, a hero for doing exactly what you did, what you said, the way you described it. But he's not comfortable, and I felt something that happened to him that is happening to all of us, which is the pressure to shut up. Dima Sadeh, I don't know her personally, but I've spoken to her. You feel it in her voice. You know that somebody who's confident and assertive and bold in her way is frightened, and she has every right to be. And suddenly I realized that the people that I want here in this country carrying this cause, you're one of these people as well. Everyone is taking a step back. And I think the narrative is shifting in the wrong direction. Now, that's the backdrop to why I wanted to talk to you, because you're very assertive about how you see the problem. You are very blunt in describing Hezbollah's role today in Lebanon. And I wanted to maybe engage your mind and see if any of what I say makes sense to you, and maybe we can build on this. So that's my long introduction. I will start.
That's why I love you, Ron.
Oh, you know what? We're co-hosts in a way. So you take the wheel whenever you want. I guess
the last point you said about being assertive, addressing the problem I see directly. For me, it was after August 4. I wasn't there. I had just fled Lebanon maybe a couple of weeks before. So I don't have the first-hand experience that everyone else has. So that's been hard to come to terms with. The feeling of guilt, not being there, blah, 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 all that stuff. But I had to get past that quickly because everyone else back home was busy trying to search for their loved ones under the rubble and do what the government should have been doing when no one was taking care. You would see Gibran Bassil go on TV, try to push his own narrative that this is a chance for Lebanon and now they'll talk to us after he was sanctioned, blah, blah, blah. So you had to have someone countering that. For me, to put it as simply as possible, yes, كلهم يعني كلهم. Absolutely. Everyone who's worked with Hezbollah over the years is part من كلهم يعني كلهم. The example I love giving always is like it's a house that has very bad plumbing. So كل الأرض مجرير والسيفون ما بيمشي وما فينا نتحمم وكل هالقصص. But at the same time, the house is burning. So Anna, if I'm in that house, what would I choose to do first? Because the plumbing is a huge issue. And we need to fix it. We can't live in sewage. But the house is burning. Hezbollah is the house burning. Everyone else is المجرير على الأرض. When you talk about Hezbollah directly, اليوم أنا إذا حدا معه cancer ومعه قرحة, he's gonna focus on surviving the cancer before going to the ulcer, or doing it at the same time, but pretending it's all about the ulcer, or it's all about المجرير, forgetting the main issue that's actually putting people in danger. Man, isn't that far away? Your dad isn't that far away. This is not ancient history from the 70s, 80s. This is now. So I know and I understand, and even though the Hezbollah orbit uses that, you can't speak from America. Bala, Habibi, I can, because there you'd get killed if you speak that, even though we're speaking that anyway. So I know that my brothers and my sisters there can't be as open. So that's why I go that extra mile and focus on that, because other people can't. Yeah, and I don't wake up thinking about Hezbollah in the morning and what to do about it. But the frustration of everyone pretending giving in to the fear, خلاص ما فينا نعمل شيء about Hezbollah, let me just do silly things and focus on ignoring the elephant in the room. I guess that would encapsulate why I'm taking that kind of position, especially after August 4. And it's clear, no matter what the excuses, and now we see them trying to push the narrative of an attack again, of a strike. It doesn't matter. You put your explosives that you're using in Syria with Assad in the middle of my city. No other excuse can exonerate you from that. So that's in a nutshell how I see what I'm doing right now, and the focus on Hezbollah. Again, it's the house that's burning. Sure, we need to fix the sewage too. We can do it at the same time, or start with the fire first. But to ignore the fire makes me go crazy sometimes. I'm like, how is this guy or girl really thinking that this still passes? After all this time, what more do we need? I remember a time when they used to tell us, Jubran Touaini, Muhammad, like it's and Ghanem, that they killed themselves so people will hate Hezbollah, and some people actually bought that. But that worked in 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. Today, the awareness that people have, the answer is so obvious and simple right in front of them, but the fear is stopping them from going. I'm giving them that small nudge and using the privilege and safety, quote unquote safety. Now we see this week in New York State, the Hezbollah Iranian regime are on a roll this week. So it's reminiscent a bit of the Lebanon time, which you didn't expect, moving here in the nutshell.
This is the section that I thought was, it's almost surreal that the story now extends in the places that we kind of forgot about, including someone like Salman Rushdie. In my childhood, he had already become, in a way, an expired story. The threat against him. Sorry. So that's from the 1980s, and it's 2 pages in a book that most people have not read, and suddenly he's on the news. Okay, so I'm going to try to navigate this, and I'll start also by saying I agree with you. I know that you said you don't wake up every morning thinking about Hezbollah, which is a healthy thing to do. You shouldn't think about it all the time. But I will say that distance, I don't think matters as much as it used to. Because in a way, whether you're physically here or not, the last 2 years or so, 2+ years, you've wedged your way back into the story, at least on social media. So you found a way to still be relevant in the discussion. Again, maybe it's not to everyone's liking the way you do it, but still you do it on your terms, and that in itself is quite important.
And on that, Ronnie, then for me, I'm not selling anything and I'm not running for office. So I could not care less if some people are bothered. And usually the people bothered aren't the people I'm targeting. So I don't want someone who's always bending the knee to Hezbollah to change their mind. That's always been my thinking for everyone, not just Hezbollah, including the people that are supporting the Sultan. I don't give I'm not gonna curse on Instagram to not get banned again. But I don't care about them. They're a lost cause for me. And I know they're not the majority. And that's clear. The numbers point that everywhere, the election. So I care about the person who's on the edge, wondering if, I can't change anything. Khalas, this is it forever. This is the person I care about. So I could not care less if 7,000 million accounts of pro-Aonis or pro-Hezbollah favorite this tweet or DM or put comments there. I don't give a fuck about them. They're not my target. My target is the people who are still wondering if this is the right thing they should do or not. So I think the freedom of not running for elections and not selling anything and not having a boss over my head gives me a lot of flexibility. Even during the Tawra, most of my family was already outside of Lebanon. So I wasn't worried that they'd get to them. I know a lot of my friends were worried about that, were worried about getting fired. Now, if you Google my name, you'll get the 700 million Aounist and Hezbollah stuff about it. And it's toxic to me personally. But for me, it was worth it because look where we are now. And even though it's like we're stalling in the same place, I always compare it to before, and I think we're in a much better place than we were, at least for the main problem.
So let's build on that. Let's say that, and I'm going to be a bit assertive in return because I appreciate you're going to see it differently, and you'll tell me if you see it differently. All the voices that we both disagree with on a regular basis. In your case, it was perhaps mostly pointed at one podcaster, Jad Ghossan. But forget him for a moment. Let's say anybody.
It was more Asad Abu Khalil, but Jad took the bait. Asad Abu Khalil learned already to not take my bait. That was the difference. What's important about that, I was surprised, he used, everyone keeps whining, oh, بس بيسب بس كذا, but the entire thing Jad did was fat shame me and other stuff for someone that's supposed to be this intellectual, blah, blah, blah. That was debate, and it worked. Today, the people saying, I don't care about the Hezbollah peeps and the angry Arab peeps following him. I don't care about them or their opinions about me. But everyone else who was cheated in thinking that this is the option, you should submit to Hezbollah, that he is the only hope, blah, blah, blah. This is the echo chamber. And this happened in the election. Everyone thought he's going to win, and Memphis is going to destroy everything. They did not get more than a few hundred votes in most places. And the one place Jad did well is because Memphis and him and the rest made sure there was no coalition possible. So people had no choice. It was either Brahim Kanaan or Uwait or ما بعرف شو or Kataib or Jad Ghassan. So a lot of them, they hate voted. I knew that people, this soft on Hezbollah approach wasn't going to work in Mata. And this, and even people around me didn't believe that. Everyone was on the Jad Ghassan bandwagon, but it even made me consider, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm saying this wrong, but getting stuck in this echo chamber of Twitter made them think they're going to win. At the end, Sharif al-Nahas got 200 votes in Ashrafiyya. So I'm very confident in the choices I made then and the people, and reading what the people were really thinking. If we think that it's about the hashtags, akid, it looks like Hezbollah is winning and Memphis are the biggest party on earth. But in reality, if we just look at the ground of how people are reacting to Hezbollah, and people might think, هيدا حادث فردي, هيدا حادث مدري شو. But before the Tayoun, when they tried to assassinate Judge Bitar, several times, you remember the Druze young man who beat up a Hezbollah operative who was shooting missiles from next to his house. When has this ever happened?
But okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry. I just there's something I want to share with you in a conclusion, and see if we can start from there. So everything you said considered, the back and forth, the debate, the thing that we've lived in, whether it's in social media or in politics, elections, etc. I think these extra voices that both of us disagree with regularly, maybe in different ways, but I think both of us, there's a foundation that we stand on, and there's a disagreement that we fight for, I think, in different ways, but it's the same cause, I think, which is how to move on from this issue. I think the other voices, the way they're describing the problem, I think is a natural circumstance. It's a collateral damage, I think, to Lebanese that have no control over this issue. So whether it's the more eccentrics in academia, and you mentioned one particular man, but there's many of them, that try to hypothesize and ideologize, and they have all these lexicon sort of almost like poetic words to describe one sub-state group. They're a part of it. They have no control. They have no control, period. The podcasters, the TV presenters, even for that matter, those that stand against this issue, those that want to get rid of the problem once and for all, they have no control over it either. So, for example, Hassan Sha'ban doing his job, and I have an angry cat, I'm sorry about that. If you hear him, he's just begging for attention. Get rid of him. There we go. Finally. Sorry. Hassan Sha'ban, he can share this post. He can deliver the message head on, but his influence over curtailing that group's leverage is, I think, 0%. Dima Sadiq can be very bold on Twitter and share something that most of us would not dare to share on Twitter.
Yes, I love Dima. We're old friends, and I love her.
But it doesn't.
We were even arrested together, investigated with together.
Yes, of course, I remember that.
I love Dima. But always support her, no matter what.
But her voice included, she has no impact on the way things move. If anything, things are moving in the opposite direction always. Let me include myself in this camp. Everything I talk about all the time, everything I read about, every debate I have, every panel discussion, every private, public, whatever, every tweet, I don't think I have any leverage over what's happening. and on the other side too, from the more intelligent and perhaps more eloquent voices to the more rugged, violent types, I don't think they have control either, and that's a big problem. So all of us, whether we stand against this issue, whether we support it, or for that matter, whether we're gray on the subject, none of us have any agency. And that, I think, is exactly how the landscape evolved. This is why we are always talking with each other and getting nowhere. This is why on occasion we fight against each other, but also don't get anywhere. We entertain each other, but it doesn't necessarily...
It is a lot of fun.
And it's fun sometimes. You make it fun sometimes. You actually do.
I enjoy it.
But I mean, in 2022, late August, we're further away from ending this nightmare than we were maybe 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we were already far away from ending this nightmare. You project a decade in advance as we get older. It's going to probably be further away from the ability to grasp control.
Maybe.
Yeah, but
see,
okay,
where I disagree with you about this is you're not comparing it to something else. So Hezbollah right now is better than everyone, for sure, more stronger, has more money to pay their fighters in dollars, all that stuff. But compare it to Hezbollah of pre-2019 or even 2006, it's a disaster. So, and you're right, we're not getting anywhere. But where are they getting? Their entire thing is waiting for the Iran deal, which already failed in Vienna. So when they wake up and realize they've been wasting all this time and taking all our money away because they think that the money from Iran will come back, yeah, and it's even worse than what we're looking forward to. At least we're organizing, which never happened before when you look at 10, 15 years ago. Now we have parties who have members of parliament. So yeah, if you take it just the snapshot of it right now, it's definitely not where we want it to be. But I always like to compare it to us before, one, and to them. What are they doing? Do they have any idea what they're doing? He says, you'll always get paid in dollars and we will never go hungry. 3 months later, we need to plant on the balcony for Jihad al-Zira'a because we're going to starve because of America. And the guy who helped make us starve, Marwan Khairuddin, they're trying to get as an MP now, which is the head of a bank that they're supposed to be against, and they blow up sometimes. So for me, I'm always worried that we're not where we should be, but compared to them, the vision that we have, I think is much better, and compared to where we were before, we're also much better. And honestly, Ronnie, even if you don't like this, I think a good thing about October 17 is we killed the remnants of March 14. This idea of the dichotomy of 8 and 14, you see it, whether it's with Jad or any other Mumena group. They always try to reinvigorate the 8 and 14. For me, it's the same. They all sat in bed with Hezbollah, and they're all gone. October 17 is a billion times better. It's built upon what 14 March did and included a lot more people. March 14 didn't include everyone. October 17 does. So this need for this dichotomy, I think, is the problem, and we got over it. When you used to talk about Hezbollah, now everyone talks about Hezbollah. If you said something about Nasrallah, you'd get beaten up and be forced to go on Manar carrying his photo. I'm sorry, but the like Sermetak, blah, blah, blah. Who does that now? So I'm not as pessimistic if you step back a bit and look at it. I think Hezbollah, even though it's still the strongest, it's the weakest it's ever been.
I'll go down that road with you. Now, I'm going to, there's something I really want to drive home, and I'll try to do it in a way that ties all of this together. I think trying to end what Hezbollah represents today, which is a paramilitary force that can pressure the Lebanese state to a point of either complete collapse or, in more recent years, versions of paralysis, where the Lebanese state is not really there anymore. We're not entirely a failed state, but we're very close to one. But this kind of limbo, where you have a state that cannot independently make any fundamental decisions, I think we're consistently moving further away from that the more we talk about it. And I'm going to go back now a bit in time. The reason what Dima Sadeh and Hassan Shaban did, in my mind, was more familiar to the 2004, early 2005 period, where you had journalists taking decisions that were quite confrontational against the state that those years was really bent to Syria's concerns back then. So you have actors like Jamil
During the
al-Sayed
occupation.
during the occupation, and you have somebody like Samir Asir who's getting arrested, who's getting death threats. You have Gibran 20 trying to elevate the pitch a bit. You have the Bristol Gathering, which was a blending of intelligentsia and politics. But anyway, you had a pressure against the Syrian regime, which was building up. I don't know, I really don't know if the Syrian regime era ends because of that. I think.
Obviously not.
Right, I think solid diplomacy that put pressure against the Syrian regime forced the Syrian regime to make a decision that it did not want to make, which is how to exit Lebanon without looking like they're guilty. And it was very, very messy, but it happened. And there was enough assertive leverage to at least consider that the Lebanese state could become, again, an independent actor. Now, in that period of time, you have multiple journalists that are killed, including Samir Asir and Gibran 20. You have other thinkers, and some of them are names that we let go of. I mean, you have leftists like George Harvey. You have a string of assassinations against politicians and intelligence agents, all intelligence officials, all of them March 14 affiliated. But I think the pressure then was more assertive than it is now. And today, we have a Lebanese state that is never going to consider opening an international investigation into the port blast. Back then, we had remnants of a struggling Lebanese state being born again to at least demand one thing, which was almost cursed to death in this country, a special tribunal for Lebanon, which after many years points the finger but none of us can actually get those individuals in jail. So the agency is not there. And I think today, the reason I started with August 4, the anniversary, is because we're watching the port silos, what's left of them, fall. They're burning, and they're going to collapse. The Lebanese state right now, I think, is completely paralyzed to the point that it's wishful thinking to think that there will be any international involvement and trying to at least point in the right direction. That's gone. Now, this is where we come in. Actors here and abroad that I think want this nightmare to end. Some of us don't see it the same way. Maybe some of us prioritize other things first. Maybe that's not the right thing to do, but regardless, I think the majority, and you kind of hinted at this, the majority want an end to the paralysis, the plunder, and the nightmare. Now, this is where I struggle because unlike you, I do wake up every morning thinking about this problem. And I'd like to pitch an idea to you. You and I witnessed 2 deals that were dealt abroad that destroyed chances for an independent country. The first is our recent history. It's an agreement in Doha in 2008, which forever altered our neighborhood that we love the most. Ras Beirut and Hamra today is unrecognizable for many reasons, but it begins then. The streets are bloody because of a deal made at Lebanon's expense thereafter, solidifying it, saying that that's going to be the norm. Violence by Hezbollah does create politics, period. It's the biggest blunder to Lebanon's sovereign ambitions. 2 things that are dealt with by Hezbollah: firing a customs security agent at the airport, trying to dismantle telecoms across the country. Hezbollah lays siege. So Doha accepts that as the norm for politics. We grew up, we got older in those years thereafter, but prior to that, we have Ta'if. Ta'if cements...
Exactly, I was just going to say, it's the exact same thing where we just pretend nothing happens and accept the threat of violence and pretend that this is normal.
Exactly. So Doha gives us Iran. We become Iran's privilege after 2008. We're Syria's privilege in the 90s and early 2000s. And then we both don't know what Lebanon was like really pre-Civil War, or for most of the Civil War maybe. But
I don't even know what it was like during the Civil War. So I was born right after. So
Right.
I guess maybe that made me a bit freer to take positions that those that remembered it couldn't, because it wasn't always in the back of my mind. So I don't care about the civil war if Hezbollah tries to attack and kill a judge. I don't say, okay, let them, I don't want war. I'm like, bro, you're trying to kill the guy investigating what the biggest explosion in history that was non-nuclear. No, sorry. I don't care if it's a dog whistle since the wartime. لا اوعى عن الدين اوعى مدري شو البوسطة وهيك عن الرمانة. خلاص خيي.
Okay, but so you're exactly why October 17 is the most successful protest movement in Lebanese history. That's clear. But before our time, there's an agreement in Cairo that makes Lebanon part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, not just part of it, the forefront of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And suddenly the south and in Beirut, there is a militia determining the future of this country. So I think, this is my pitch, and I want to see if you see it this way or not. I think the tunnel begins in 1970. And I think we got deeper and deeper into that tunnel as the years progressed. And 2008 is just a continuation of that deep, despairing tunnel. And I think using diplomacy in a good way, not using diplomacy in a bad way, not a regional settlement that makes Lebanon worse, but rather one that ends the nightmare, one that builds on Lebanese lost independence and lost agency. I think that's the path forward. And for that reason, for me at least, I think Lebanese in Lebanon have very limited influence to determine our future, because that's a big, big push. That's a summit, that's an international agreement to dislodge Lebanon once and for all. Now, does any of that resonate with you, and do you think of that as the way out, or do you see it more that Lebanese at home have to get their shit together first, post Instagram?
I love that question, actually, Ronnie, because it's nuanced a bit and multifaceted in my mind. Yeah. First, if we just look at it from a scientific method perspective, what affects the Sultan in charge the most? It wasn't the hela hela ho that made Gibran change what he was doing. It was sanctions by the United States Treasury Department, no matter what he says, this is it. So partly the diplomacy and thinking about what the West can do is definitely effective. But for me, I'm also worried about that, because in my mind, I immediately think the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and how Obama allowed the cocaine smuggling, alleged, so they don't say, of Hezbollah to continue as a goodwill gesture. And that's what helped them make up for the money lost when Iran got sanctioned later on by Trump. So this smuggling business is what keeps them afloat, why they're still paying part of their fighters in dollars. So for me, I cannot count on an administration, because it changes every 4 years or 5 years or 6 years, wherever that country is. So building my entire hope upon them doing something, I wouldn't personally, but it has to be a part of it. Another thing that's a problem with this, you saw what Macron did, how much he tried to save them after August 4. So I don't see them as an ally or that I need their help. I don't need their help. And why do I say we don't need their help right now? Because the times you were talking about, whether it was the Arab-Israeli conflict in the 70s or the early 2000s when Syrian occupation of Assad was still ongoing, Lebanon was a priority for everyone. Now it's not. No one cares about what's happening in Lebanon. It's just lip service and INGOs, etc. That might be taken as something bad and no one cares about us, blah, blah, blah. But I think that's something good, because every time at the last minute, someone from abroad swoops in and saves them. Whether it's said, or whether it's there is 1-2, whether it's promises that the IMF is going to bail us out, blah, blah, blah. They always had that. So they'd always get us to the edge of the cliff, and someone would swoop in. Saudi, yalla, this $10 billion, put them in the bank, get your stuff started. Doha agreement, blah, blah, blah. Now we're in this weird spot where there's so many other more important issues on the geopolitical diplomatic agenda that we're very down the list of priorities. That, for me, is something good, because if they don't meddle to come save the Sultan, it creates a space for us to be able to decide what happens or try to change something, because we knew before we couldn't. If it wasn't Syria doing it, it would be Saudi. If it wasn't Saudi, it would be Iran, the US, Europe, France, Germany, blah, 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 whoever was involved all this time. Now, we're not a priority. And I think that's one of the reasons why October 17 was able to spread so much, because no one came in to quash it so violently till Hezbollah showed up. So in terms of the diplomacy, I'm completely on board with you. This is how things work at the end. But for me, I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket. It definitely has to happen in tandem with a lot of things. And the fact that we're not a priority, at least the past few years and right now, especially after COVID, inflation everywhere, blah, 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 no one cares about that much. So we have a space where we can actually do something that might be better. And like you were saying, maybe 10 years when we look at this, I know for sure it's going to be different in 10 years than now. It could be much worse. It could be slightly better, though. And that's where I'm trying to fit myself in. And like you said, we're trying to distance ourselves to blah, blah, blah. I did that after the elections. I thought, no, khalas, I'm putting too much energy on this, and still I feel that we're very far away from that. But then I'm like, no, I'm not. And everything we did to them and the case that they're in today, and the fact that I have the ability to, we have to keep doing this. A lot of people can't do that, either because they're scared or they just have family, they need to worry about that stuff. They can't worry about this day-to-day stuff. So that's where I hope we can play a small role, which is that change that's happening now, we can steer it a bit into the kind of Lebanon we want, where books aren't banned, parties aren't cancelled, we're not threatened every week by a live stream from a guy in hiding for 16 years. You know, all that stuff. I think the only thing keeping them holding on power, because we know that the economic social network that they created is pretty bad, and you can see it between the difference between civilian Hezbollah and military Hezbollah, and you see it between Amal and Hezbollah. Amal still get paid in liras, Hezbollah are getting paid in dollars. So this time, even though we think they're, you know, undefeatable and it's always gonna be like that, I think the fear is what keeps us thinking that. Because if you think about it, Hezbollah didn't kill and beat us all up. They beat a few and killed a few of us. It's the fear that keeps us in line. But today, you know, can Hezbollah come and kill all 6 million of us? I don't think so. It's the fear that keeps us in line. You're like, khalas, I'm not even gonna suggest this because I know Hezbollah isn't gonna let me. And you see it now, like when they try to form a government, when they khalas, if Thunai'i doesn't want, I don't even bother anymore. And that's like a free work for Hezbollah, where you just they make you afraid a bit. They send 20 guys on motorcycles to yell and beat a few people and burn some stuff. Everyone is like, nothing will change, khalas. Okay, do whatever you want. And you can see that very clearly in the offshore oil and gas thing. And I look at people who have been extremely against the government, and they're like, khalas khayyi, just make this happen, negotiate with Israel, let us start extracting the oil. Khayyi. One, you're gonna let people like Gibran Basir, Walid Jumblat, Hedole extract oil offshore in 2022 when everyone else is moving away from fossil fuels? No one paused and thought, how can I let Sulta by Hezbollah run such a dangerous kind of exploration of offshore oil and gas when they can't even pick up garbage, when they don't even have electricity? If an oil spill happens, what are we going to do? So everyone just suspended this and said, khalas, if Hezbollah wants it and is negotiating with Israel, we should all accept this reality and move on as if it's a done deal. No.
Let's assume everything you said is actually true. And yes, they cannot run the country in a way that would be full control. And I don't think this group anyway needs to do that or wants to do that. I think their comfort zone is not there anymore, but it's being able to circumvent the state and abuse it to the point that it serves its interests long term. That flexibility, I think, has been curtailed, and that's why they're in an uncomfortable place. The Lebanese state doesn't work anymore, and they're blamed for it too. So this is a very, very difficult chapter for them in trying to reassert without over-asserting.
I wouldn't envy them if I was in their position. They're in a very tough spot, because the money from Iran dried up. Everyone doesn't like them, and the systems that they kept their Bia under control are disintegrating. At the end of the day, most people, the government wasn't providing, Hezbollah was. Hezbollah isn't, at least not as much anymore.
You're right, but I'll add to that, which is I don't think they need to. So in other words, back in the bad days, early 2000s, it was a matter of silencing opposition. It was a matter of pressuring Lebanese to shut up, whether it was the names we mentioned earlier, or for that matter, this is going back in time now, this is unthinkable. The Free Patriotic Movement, before it comes back to full force, they're being beaten up, they're being silenced. This is the only crowd that wanted the Syrian regime out, and they were paying a price for it, as well as other groups that were some were in jail still, some were banned, like the Lebanese forces, and et cetera, et cetera. All these groups, this was a pressure tactic, and it worked for many years so that the Syrians could stay on top. I think we're going through that right now. But the reason that I'm putting more onus, let's say, on this diplomatic front rather than the internal capacity is because I know this for a fact. The new crowd, the one that both of us championed in different ways, the ones that we celebrated when they won, they're as incapable, they have as little to no leverage as reformers in the past had in trying to get us out of this. And I'll just give you one example. Whether it's somebody very decent like Najed Saliba talking about the port fire and pollution, whether it's someone that maybe we have complicated relations with today, but Nasser Yassin, who's the minister, he's the environmental minister, neither one of these two people can actually do much. And if they can, it's at the cosmetics to make them look like they're doing something always. And unfortunately, that includes Twitter, that includes selfies, that includes a lot of posts, not much politics. And I think it's not their fault. And it's not their fault. I think they would want to do more and they can't. And I don't know.
I wouldn't compare Najat to Nasser because Najat, we got her into office. Nasser was appointed by the Sultan. So I would give more credit to that. And I think the difference between them and the quote unquote against the hegemony of Hezbollah back then is that the others were willing to work with Hezbollah and after Doha. If these 13 or 12 MPs do that, we won't get them back into power and they won't come back on alone. They can't go to Doha and ask a prince from abroad to install them as prime minister or president like they did now, because they simply wouldn't become MPs again. We wouldn't get them back into office.
But let's go with what you said earlier.
MPs, just think of it. We need a lot of work. This is for everyone listening who wants to support them. They need teams around them, and there's amazing volunteers there. But at the end of the day, today, I think they get paid like $300 a month. So if this is the one thing they're doing and they're not working somewhere else, we need to figure out that the team that they need to pay, it needs to be us volunteering or figuring out how we can give them the resources they need, because having a Banyan every 2 months isn't the kind of work we need. But having them inside, at least it's eyes and ears behind closed doors that we never knew. Before, we used to count on honest ministers to tell us what happened. For example, like what's his face, Ghassan Khayber, when he was still Aouni. It turns out that most of the time he was lying to make himself look good. Now I know that if I talk to one of these MPs that I personally know, they're not lying to me. So that, at least that is good enough for me now that you can build upon. And if they do the 14 March route of bending the knee to Hezbollah, they won't become MPs anymore because we made them MPs this time. And we won't next time.
Let's say the stuff you said earlier, let's go with that, saying that Lebanon is not a priority to anyone except Iran. And let's assume also that we kind of agree to it, that diplomacy is, at the end of the day, going to be a big part of how to dislodge Lebanon from ever having this problem again in its future. Is it the role of an MP from this change bloc to stand up and say that they will not negotiate with this group? And is it their role to say that they stand for a diplomatic solution? Or do you think of it as sort of beyond their scope? Because I get frustrated when I see that some of the 13 MPs, they warm up to Hezbollah parliamentarians in parliament, and sometimes they're very eager to have this outreach in a way that seems naive, almost like Hezbollah is just a political story. If you just sit down and talk, you'll figure things out. That's talking for the sake of talking.
What ON did, what March 14 did, they kept thinking, they will influence Hezbollah and get them back to Lebanon. Look where that turned out. Gibran Bassil stopped wearing ties because of that.
So, but what does a change MP do that's different? Meaning, how do they stand for trying to find an end to Iran in Lebanon in terms of security, Hezbollah, weapons, etc.? And how do they do it in a local way that doesn't expose themselves? Because I sense that if any of these change MPs did what was done before, whether you like March 14 or don't, whether you think the idea expired 17 years ago or didn't, whatever you think about that movement, I think it is the same route Hezbollah would take in making sure October 17 in Parliament doesn't behave the same way. And if it does, it's over. And they've already sent that message. I mean, Luqman Slim is not October 17 in politics per se, but they've already reminded us that civil society is exposed too. So I don't know what can be done differently to make sure that there's external and internal sort of lining up. Yeah.
I wouldn't put that role on Parliament, because at the end of the day, their job is to legislate stuff that have effect on your day-to-day life. Because at the end of the day, a piece of legislation with enough magnitude to affect Hezbollah, it won't pass. You'll have another May 7, you'll have another assassination. So that is not why it's important to have a seat on the table there. And for me, I'd rather that they focus on the day-to-day stuff, like when they talk about how they're going to stop the NHR and their policies about that collapse. For me, that's a lot more important because that's their job. And at the end of the day, in a parliament that's controlled by Nabih Berri and Samir Jaja or Gibran Bassil, the real change isn't going to happen that way. I see that change, the meaningful change in day-to-day life happening in the municipal elections, which is why after the parliamentary elections, this is everything I'm focusing on. Why? Because we have over 7,000 municipalities in Lebanon, okay? The municipalities are the local authority, and you've lived here, you know that you don't interact with the federal government, nor even New York State, if you're living in New York City. It's the city. They decide everything in your life. So, but who knows who the city councilman of their borough is? No one, but everyone knows who the senator is, etc. So for me, the one way we can actually go beyond just talking and having nice ideas is actually governing. And there is some examples of that working. And I know some people will be upset, but one I actually saw with my own eyes, after 2015, the garbage issue, the Baladiyya and BUKRA and surrounding Baladiyat came together and they did a solid waste management recycling program. Today, it's generating revenue for them to actually get more trucks and do the recycling correctly. The central government has tried to derail that so many times because they want the money to go to Ramco or Suklin or whatever they install. So that was a meaningful change in people's quality of life that actually helped that community. So if we can do that in few municipalities, people who didn't win in this parliamentary elections, people who don't want to do the politics but want to do the development, this is the perfect example of how you break this cycle. And you see the Momena always saying, we have Hezbollah because there's no state, so we need Hezbollah. How do you make a state? We're not going to win 128 MPs ever. There's people directly benefiting from the Sultan. And whether we like it or not, there's over 350,000 public employees with their spouses and their children. That's at least a quarter of the country that will never leave a Sultan no matter what, because their livelihood depends on it. But if a town controlled by Hizb or Awniyya or Uwait, they're paying Ramco, there's still garbage in the streets, they don't have electricity, they didn't organize like creating solar farms paired up with diesel gensets to make up the power that isn't given. We can do this. We can do all of that in a municipality. And what's the central government under Hezbollah gonna do if you do a solar farm and are able to provide 24/7 electricity with, of course, like a diesel genset or something temporarily? Are they gonna come stop you from getting electricity? I'd love to see them come and try to do that. Which town would let some Darake or army or intelligence come in and unplug their electricity because Zaim مش عاجبه? So I think the parliamentary elections was great because it showed we exist and we are a sizable enough one. We got the most aswat tafdiliye in the country if you take each party of them alone. So we do exist. And based on that, because the problem with the elections, it was so hard to make coalition because everyone thinks they're the best and everyone loves them. And we gave the example about Memphis. But in reality, that didn't become a reality. Now we have the numbers. I know that Rani can get this much in Beirut. So I will figure out how to do a coalition, run with Rani and run the municipality of Beirut. So the kind of change away from the Hezbollah teeth that everyone is using, at least the ones benefiting from them, is to create another one where it has an actionable change in people's daily lives. And I think the Baladiyat can be a very important start after the municipal elections. We know we have people, we know we can win. The municipal elections are worse because it's أكترية, it's مش نسبي, it's not proportional. And you remember in 2016 when we were all Beirut Madinati, we got 40% of the vote but 0 seats. And that was way back then. So imagine what we could do now if the law was a bit better. I'm not hopeful that the law will change, but we should anyway focus on that. If you get a few baladiyat and you do a union between them, if they're close enough, you can actually govern no matter what Hezbollah or On or Basil or any of the Sulta has to say about it.
Okay,
that's a nutshell, I think.
No, it's always an important component, and sometimes I leave it to the side unintentionally, which is how.
I think all of us do. That's why I'm talking about it a bit, because people don't notice, and it's easier to get to a municipal chief. How can you get to a wazir with 700 bodyguards and tinted windows? But the guy who's going to be in the baladi, if he's not your relative, he's your neighbor, and you're going to see him when you go to church or the restaurant or the mosque. So he won't screw you over as much as a minister. Whereas if a minister is aouni, when he comes, he will only benefit the people around him and screw over everyone else. And Hizb and Uwait, all of them did that every time. Because a wazir's job is to get to the central government and try to take as much money from it as they can, like Hamad Hassan and Hezbollah did when, after Iran stopped sending the money, suddenly they want the Ministry of Health, and I wrote a huge report about how they mismanaged money to funnel it to them a day after the August 4 blast. August 5, they tripled Hezbollah's hospitals budgets, and they kept the budgets of Rum, AUBMC, and Ja'itawi, which were actually damaged by the blast, the same. We were all too busy picking up the shards. Everyone was too busy doing that to notice. So, لا خي ما بعرف. I think
Let me go to the top, and then we can jump deep into the municipality thing, because it's a way to kind of show how to confront a huge problem at a very local level. Let me give you an analogy. 17 years of prime ministers that came in and out. Saad Hariri more or less defined 2005 until 2020, but there were others. There's Najib Miati, there's Hassan Diab, there's Tamim Slam, there's
the spare tire of Hezbollah is what I call it. Whenever they're in a jam, Miati, yalla ta. Every time, 2000 after Hariri's assassination.
Yeah, so you have a very chaotic local politics that is being punched repeatedly, violently by Hezbollah, but not just by Hezbollah. These Lebanese groups are expiring in different ways. But Hezbollah is at least making sure that reform is not going to happen anytime soon. In that story, there's one thing that I think will be deemed a victory later, which is we were able to take the story of political assassinations, even when they kept happening, even if the numbers increased exponentially. The subject, that thing, there was an investigation where the geography of the court and the verdict is issued away from us. We have a special tribunal that does not collapse when Saad Hariri collapses in Lebanon. And actually, even when Hezbollah is making it clear, they will not tolerate the verdict, they will not assist in the verdict, and actually, if anything is done against them, they will react violently. Even when that's happening, the tribunal is immune. And yes, the verdict is a bit uninspiring, but there's names directed at this group, and now Lebanese can do wishful thinking as much as they want. They can deny reality. They can create standards that are higher than The Hague. It doesn't matter. We know the truth. We know that one group is playing a fundamental role in political violence, period. Now, You go today. I would like that kind of investigation into the port blast. And I know it's not going to happen. I know that now, 2 years later, it's not going to happen. And the silos, half of them are being knocked down soon. It's a government decree. The southern silos will stay up as long as they can last.
Even the ones that at sabotage, it's clear. Yeah,
Right. So, but this is
the fires.
happening 2 years after the blast. It's now, I think, taken for granted there won't be an international investigation. Is there a way to actually put pressure against that tide through what you're describing? Because I don't see it happening. Even at the very local level, which you eloquently just expressed, the desire to start on the ground level and hold people to account at the ground level. I think that doesn't solve that bigger issue. I think it actually just, in a way, it may offer some short-term respite in a very local way. But I think Lebanon as a state is still falling apart. It's still collapsing. So, I mean, can you add to that maybe?
My opinion on the port investigation, I know is not going to be very popular with people listening and friends and everything. I didn't think it would ever work from day one because I like to look at precedent, at how things normally work. When has a court actually ever done a proper investigation into something? Let's assume they did and they got the initial verdict or the indictment. Who is gonna implement it? Bassam Maulawi or what's his face, the other guy, Osman? Or who's gonna implement it? So for me, I know justice doesn't mean that Michel Aoun or Rais al-Wuzara, whoever it will be or whatever, they're gonna actually do a verdict and it's nice. What's interesting about Tariq Bitar is he is unexpected. We did not think a judge with spine that would stand in front of Hezbollah trying to literally openly saying, I'm gonna go approach you from the ground. It was a kind of surprise, and for me, I'm like, why is this guy doing that? I was always skeptical about it. So for me, I'm past that. I think, like I said initially, that thousands of tons of explosives, we know who it was for. That's the most important thing for me. Everyone who tries to say, خلاص هاي من سنتين وما بيهمني أنا, that's why you need to keep reminding them. Arba Ab has to be like a huge rock on Hezbollah's and the Sulta's chest. We need to always keep pivoting back to that. It can't be only the kilon, يعني kilon 17 20 etc. We used that momentum already. Now we have something that unifies everyone, because even people who weren't with the Thawra died and their homes exploded. And even if they rebuilt their homes or blah blah blah, and they're like, okay, I'm fine with that. At the end of the day, this broke this trust that you had with them. So for me, thing to rally around more is August 4 because of everything it represents. Because it is Hezbollah's explosives, but everyone else knew they were there and did nothing. So that's not saying that everyone else wasn't involved. But like everything, if you're an accessory to murder, it's not like you're the murderer. The murderer is still the murderer. But being an accessory is still as bad. So for me, I'm sad to say I never expected an actual investigation, an actual verdict, an actual justice happening in the stuff we see on TV, like a judge ordering and someone going to jail. That's not going to happen in Lebanon. We know that. During the civil war, a lot worse things happened, and no one got in trouble for it. Even after the war, no one. So my bet isn't about betting on Bitar and he will get everything right, but it's reminding people why this explosion happened, why, with everything that was already going on, the collapse, the pandemic, someone put a nuclear bomb 3-4 meters away from where we live, where we go out, where we study, etc. And 2 days later, Nasrallah was on TV laughing and smirking every time he says something, one of his snide jokes. So for me, that is the justice. People understanding what being so compliant and obedient to Hezbollah, where it leads us. Where has it ever led us to something good?
But okay, so I'm going to throw in another comparison. I think the way you're describing it, the reminder, without a process, without an investigation that is solid, without a verdict, I think, this is a guess, had there been no international push to hold either the Syrian regime to account, or for that matter, Iran to a degree, in terms of at least showing that Hezbollah is involved, I think the Hariri assassination 2 years after would have been exactly like what we're talking about right now, which is Lebanese are kind of aware of who did it to a degree. We accept it.
Less
Even
so
we
back
don't-
then, remember? Less so. Now people, it's so undeniable now. Back then, a lot of people were like, no, maybe it's not them.
Right, but I mean, in terms of being able to move things in a better direction, I think it would have been worse without that kind of tribunal, at least giving us the solid proof. This time around, maybe we're more accepting to reality. Maybe most Lebanese today have woken up to realize that Iran does have a very important, damaging role in this country. At the same time, I don't think we're not getting any closer to ending the nightmare, which is how to get rid of this whole problem once and for all. I'm going to circle back to the beginning of the conversation because I really want to build on something. People like us, anyone that's living here or living abroad, with all of what we said combined, how do Lebanese reclaim the state when it's so overwhelmed by an external state? How do we do it? Persuasion, I think, is what both of us live through, meaning we're trying to engage and maybe if we're lucky, get some confused voices to be more confused or undecided voices to decide that maybe we're right. But that doesn't really steer things in a better direction. We kind of said that already. Do you imagine a scenario where all of what we said right now becomes part of Lebanese politics? So for example, Lebanese that have credibility in politics in this country are calling on diplomatic action to get Iran's security to end in Lebanon. And Lebanese citizens are focusing on local elections, municipal elections, so that they can weather the storm better. And the Change MPs are not negotiating with, and you mentioned it, not negotiating with Hezbollah because they're adamantly unwilling to repeat mistakes made by the March 14 coalition. Is that something?
And they're scared of their voters at the end of the day. And we're not, October 17 voters aren't as docile as March 14, where I can tell them, okay, we are against Syrian hegemony, then 5 weeks later, running in elections with Nabih Berri and Hassan Nasrallah. So I think we don't give people credit enough for actually noticing this stuff. And I think that's why they're not as ready to go into the arms of Nasrallah so easily. But that doesn't mean, just protesting inside. At the end of the day, Hezbollah has MPs. So you need to sit in that same place, given under these rules of the parliament. But doing that out of that institution was the problem of the rest, I think. And today, if they're in the legionary with Hezbollah, I didn't vote for them to go protest inside the parliament. That's not why I want them to be MPs. I want MPs because all the others are extremely stupid and incompetent and just get on WhatsApp what to vote and what to do. These guys, at least, you can have a back and forth with them. If they had an idea that didn't work out, I mean, we see that sometimes. They're still finding their footing in terms of are they a bloc or not, what are they going to do, blah, blah, blah. But they're getting there because everything takes time. And for your question, which is always the one that the Moana I love giving, طب شو الحل تبعك? I think the problem we have, coming from a science background, what you understand about the world and the nature is that it's never a simple thing. It's not a video game. There isn't a very clear set path, and if you finish every level, you'll get to the final boss. Life doesn't work like that. Just like, I don't like mosquitoes, but if I remove them from the entire ecosystem, it'll all collapse because they all need each other for a million different ways. A lot of the things we talked about today can implement in شو الحل تبعك لحزب الله. اليوم إذا I can control my actual local authority away from Sab'a Ayyar, away from Tayoune, away from all the Hezbollah. Are they going to go up to a town in Akkar to forcibly force them not to implement reforms? I doubt it. I don't think so. And you see that from who they target with their violence. So it's always the Masade, the other Abaisi. It's always what they think is their BR, exclusive to them versus others. Because that reinforces their sectarian thing. Because if people are sectarian in Lebanon, you can reduce all the Shia into Hezbollah, which is not true. And everyone falls into that. They're like, لا ما بدي احكي عن حزب الله بدي الشيعة يجوا معي خي مين قال لك انه الشيعة كلهم مع الحزب ما the first people نزل 17 تشرين ما كان الانتلكتشوالز وطبعا الحمراء وهيك. It was people بمناطق حزب الله نزلت أول شيء, whether it's in Sur, whether it's in Dahi, which they never did before. So when we do this إنه oh I don't talk about Hezbollah because I don't want to insult الشيعة. أخي كل الشيعة اللي وقفوا ضد حزب الله you literally إنه حطيتهم على الخزو إنه أنت no أنا ما بدي احكي مع الناس على الموتويات وكذا, بس كمان اقول انه انا ما بدي اجيب سيره الحزب لان بيزعلوا الشيعة. طب ما اذا انا شيعي وقاعد بالنص وعم فكر شو بدي اعمل, ماني مبسوط بحزب الله, شو بعمل هون in this case؟ باكل قتلي وبتهبل انه هيدا ولا I find a way to appeal to them more. طب ما يقعدوا عايزين حزب الله هالقد, في ناس that believe in it بس the rest عم يستفيدوا. One هي هيدا, two is not being afraid. I know it's weird saying that وأنا برا, بس I was saying that بلبنان كمان. It's not like إنه معمول شيء لأنه فلت وما بقدر. بس like we said, being afraid of them or their narratives, يعني وقت يعملوا جواد نصر الله يعمل تويت إنه لازم نقتل ديما صادق, قاعد ببيته هيدا بالأي سي عم يستعمل تويتر in American thing, so he's unlikely to do it properly. بس the fear that instilled وقت 500,000 fake account يجي عليك للنهار will do the work that Hezbollah wants to do for free. If enough people aren't afraid, بيصير كتير, لأنه what do they have other than violence? راني, give me one plan that they have, comprehensive plan. ساعة نتجه شرقا وناسي إنه 2 million Muslims محطوطين ب concentration camps بتشاينا, إنه لإله كل شيء مش أمريكا يعني منيح لإله. هلا أنت بدك تروح عند شي جي بين ويعطيك هو جهاد الزراعة لأن أنت قلت له وأنت ما بتحب أمريكا, إنه they don't have a policy. None of their ministers. محمد حسن لك شو هيدا الإنسان قاعد يتصور لي إنه قاعد بالمستشفى عم يمضي وراه وهو عنده كوفيد, لك شو هدول, what joke is this group? They have nothing else to offer غير هيدا الفير, إنه إذا ما عملتوا هيك بيجي الصحصوح عليك, ننزل نحرق القبضة, منخبط يلي قاعدين عم يحكوا مثل لقمان سليم وكذا وقت كانوا بالعزرية ينزلوا يحكوا ينزلوا عليهم الشباب. Other than that, what do they have? وشوية مساعد.
But there's one problem in this whole disaster. There's one problem. Even before the elections, we know it's not true. All of these slogans of these political parties that have answers, that they're going to find a way to disarm the last militia, they're going to reclaim our independence, all over the highway. Sovereignty, sovereignty, sovereignty. From the usual suspects and from some of the new MPs as well. So there's that empty rhetoric, which for me is a bad thing because it gives the other team an excuse that there's no policy towards this group.
And they need it. They need it. Think of it. West didn't run against Hezbollah in any district, but they both used the rhetoric against each other for their own base. So today I'm not as extreme against Hezbollah as Faris Said or whatever. But when Faris Said talks, it's for his people who might vote for him, not overall. Right, so it's like extremist, just for you, not to actually fix.
Yeah, but I wanna ignore all of those voices, know that they stand for nothing today, and I want to build on policy. So let me just, and I'll wrap it up with this kind of topic because I want to figure a way that engages both the external needs that Lebanon desperately needs and the internal voices that have not maybe messaged this the right way. How do you get a diplomatic end to Iran in Lebanon? Does it require Lebanese voices in Lebanon to make this their cause? Do you imagine a situation where Lebanese come together and say, this is it, this is what we have in front of us, if we don't get there, it's over? Do you imagine, is it civil society? Is it politicians from old parties that wake up to this? Is it daring intelligentsia? Is it journalists? Where does it come from in Lebanon? Because it's never going to happen that other countries simply want to do Lebanon a favor. Yeah, that's never going to happen. But I don't want deals in cities that do disservice again and again and again. How do you make it so that Lebanese get what they need once and for all? I don't know the answer. All I know is maybe...
no one does, honestly. من الأول, no one does. And if they do, they're lying. Because this is unprecedented and you can't really extrapolate from it. But I think it's all the stuff that you mentioned, whether it's people that had bent the knee to Hezbollah realizing they didn't, whether it's journalists exposing them. So a lot of the stuff we found out about where the explosives came from and how they were smuggled was by investigative journalists. It wasn't by Tariq Bitar. It wasn't by politicians who talk rhetoric. It was journalists pounding the pavement. And some of them aren't even that against Hezbollah, but that's where the evidence of course, they didn't say Hezbollah directly, but they linked it to the Assad regime and people that they wanted to give Lebanese nationalities the sulta to try to avoid sanctions. So all of those need to happen. But the idea that, and I love when the people, إيه طب شو الحل تبعك? As if that's إنه مثل إنه جيبك جورة إنه إيه أنت ما عندك حل. As if هن عندهم any of them حل. One. Two, let's consider the other toxic thing that they all do. إنه أنت ليش بتكبوا لحزب الله بالبحر؟ ما هن لبنانية كمان. Whoever said that? Whoever said أنا بدي أقتلهم وحاربهم وكذا؟ مين اللي عم يموت ويتحارب كل وقت؟ It's the people اللي منن مع حزب الله مش حزب الله. حزب الله عم يموتوا لأن عم يحاربوا مع الأسد بسوريا، ما عم يموتوا لأن نحن عم نقتلهم. سو هيدا الريتوريك إنه هو دائما مستضعف وكل الناس ومؤامرة وكلهم جايين علينا is not true. نحن ما بدنا نلغي الحزب ولا الناس اللي معه. No one ever did that. هيدا مثل اللي بيجي بيقول لك all lives matter بدل black lives matter. They're putting a word there that isn't. اللي هي only black lives matter. I'm giving a small example عن هدول. سو اليوم هيدا اللي بيجي بيقول لك من الاول انا ما بدي احكي عن حزب الله لانه ما بدي اقتلهم. يا اخي مين بدي اقتلهم؟ ما هن عم يقتلوا فيك. That's not the thing. بس انا اليوم ما بدي حزب الله يضل داعس على رقبتي. خي هو بده يعمل، هو بيآمن بالخميني وخمانئي وما ادري شو. اقعد عندك بالبيت خيي وانت لحالك اعمل شو ما بدك، انا ما الي معك. بس تيطلع محمد رعد كل يومين ثلاثه يقول لي ما بدنا ملاهي ليليه ببيروت، هيدا مش ثقافه المقاومه والممانعه. لك مين انت تتقرر يا حبيبي؟ شو خصك انت؟ انا ما رح اجبرك تصير واعي ومنفتح ومتطور، بس انت تقرر عني هيدا ذات نيدز تو ستوب. حزب الله رح يضل والناس بيحبوا حزب الله رح تضل، ما فيها تضل على رقبتنا. واليوم من الاخر السانكشنز اللي عليهم وقد ايه مصاري صرفوا بسوريا وبالعراق وما عم يجي بقى من ايران وكذا، they're not in a place where this is sustainable for them, this chokehold that they have. كيف بدنا نحن نخلق another way to actually provide هدول البيسك necessities للناس؟ هون وين بيجي الريل تيست تبعنا اذا بدك، او how we need to focus on this policy. وكثير بيحبوا جماعه الممانعه يقول لك ايه ما في دوله سو ما عليه حزب الله. That's the wrong approach to this. ما في دوله، كيف بدي اعمل دوله؟ مثل ما قلنا it starts from the bottom up. قد ما يكون في عنا judges that can do amazing stuff. يعني مثلا ال LGBT community القانون كثير غامض تبع الفرنسويه article 534 it says sexual acts against nature. Several judges have precedents يقولوا انه this is not against nature لان في nature of that and exonerated them. So ما غيرنا بالقانون ولا بالنظام، بس the people actually pulling the levers did the right thing. And we're lucky بلبنان انه كل الناس اللي حكمونا incompetent وهبل، ان كان السوريه ان كان الفرنسويه ان كان وات ايفر كل هدول العثمانيه. سو القوانين اللي حاطينهم are very open to interpretation and that's where we see them abusing it. بس we can do the same. يعني اليوم اذا I'm not a judge انه اذا في something bad happening وانا وقفت وراه وقدر يعملها، طيب الجدج قدر يعملها، سو انا ما اضطريت اغير قانون ونظام والبرلمان والدستور وبلا بلا بلا to have an actual meaningful change in people's lives. ف it is possible. وقد ما يكون اذا عندنا 1% ناس بالدوله مراكز لها عازه we can use them, support them in a way versus بس نفكر انه خلص ما عندنا chance ابدا to do it. ف to recap على السريع it's organizing locally و giving مش افكار ولا زومز ولا برزنتيشنز حلوه ولا ارتكلز، كلهم مهمين بس مش بس. بدنا نكون كمان على الارض a real example happening and we saw Lebanese people can do that really well. What they need to they can organize themselves هيك. هلا انا بلبنان هون بس بعرف كل شيء لانه النتورك that we created بلبنان بتحكي بعرف كل شيء عم يصير وين. We have that ability ونحن اخي شاطرين ووايا، بس getting over that fear or hopelessness is the heavy part. ودايما things get better when things become extremely bad. يعني بعد الحرب العالمية بلش تزبط القصص بعد كذا. So قد ما يكون هلا مش منيح الوضع it's also when we can really change it. تخيل انه كنا نفكر القصص او نعمل الحديث اللي انا وياك عم نعمله هلا وقت كان بعده بشار الاسد وحزب الله محتلين البلد كله. كنا بشي صندوق السيارة شي محل ميتين. So when you zoom out the trajectory is good even though right now it's bad. والحل ما انه بانه نعمل حرب مع حزب الله. That's what حزب الله wants. كل يوم بيطلع نصر الله بصير يعمل هيك بالاصابيع، بدي اقتلكم بدي اقتلكم بدي اقتلكم. That's not who we are because he has nothing else to offer. بس بيخوف. شو في يعمل؟ حدا مقتنع بالحزب؟ انه هلا هو مقاومه. وين قاوم اسرائيل اخر 16 سنه؟
I know what,
برقه ولا بداون تاون بيروت؟ يعني the usual stuff that they used to hide behind isn't working anymore. and even للناس هون يعني لناس البيئه طبعا مبسوطه فيهم كان forever ما مبسوطين.
There's like, I mean, there's no way to summarize many feelings at once when it comes to this topic, but there's 2 points.
Because it's such a complex topic.
Yeah, but there's 2 things that I sort of came in and out of the last few days. The first one is that this country has probably the most impressive political aspirations possible. When half of the country is cheering the end of a nightmare, it is quite breathtaking. And it's not just once, it happens over and over. Maybe to different degrees, but it doesn't matter. 2005, 2015, 2019, these are very important milestones in protests meeting politics. And politics gets worse over time. So there's that. Protests and reality do not always line up. Actually, they don't line up in this country. So I had the one side of it. The other side is that increasingly, what feels like the Syrian years in terms of expression, there's a feeling in the air that people are not as maybe free to share all their thoughts all the time, and names that we take for granted. And for me, Hassan Shaban is a pillar when it comes to photojournalism, and he's young. He's young, but he's very good at his job. The fact that he's more cautious for reasons that are beyond his control, to me is a chilling message that the years that we grew up with have returned to a degree, and a more assertive, more confrontational maybe, voice like Dima Sadeh, she's maybe not as confrontational or as bold as she would want to be at this moment in time, and she's maybe a bit overwhelmed. Then you extrapolate.
That's the difference between us and Hezbollah, though, because for us the point isn't to die. The point is to live a nice life. So in Hezbollah, everything is about I want to die. اليوم محمد رعد كان عم يبكي على المنارة إنه بده يستشهد. عرفت? The entire thing that they can sell is wanting to kill and be killed. بأي الناس خي أنا ما بدي حسن وديما وكلهم يحطوا حالهم in trouble. أنا بيهمني هني يضلوا عايشين versus إنه عملوا سكور ضد الحزب versus الحزب that wouldn't mind killing some of their people is able to score a political point ضدك. I don't see that as something bad. I think that's something good. والأوبريشن عم تصير هلا مش مثل وقت السورية لأنه نحن أقوى. الشعب أقوى هلا من وقتها قد إيه كان. وقتها كان في a lot of people مع الاحتلال السوري. At the end of the day, it was very few loud إذا بدك ناس اللي that actually bothered. I wouldn't say that. But as long as we have غادة عون وغسانة وعيداتها in positions of power, small men like جبران وهيدول will try to abuse the judiciary for that. بس اليوم is not like وقتها. ما رح تلاقي لقمان is an example يعني otherwise. بس إنه for the average citizen it's a lot better than أيام النظام السوري. ما فيك تختفي بالبوريفاج مثلا أو يطلعوك سوريا وتختفي forever بقى. هلا بياخذوك على إيران بعد كسر.
بس you know what, Gino, I agree with you. That's you're correct. It's not as suffocating. At the same time, there's a limit that the Syrians set, and what they gave us in return is that they left Beirut and they went east. The checkpoints in Beirut ended in 2002. Their presence was less felt, but the red line was always there. And I think the red line is still here. So let me wrap it up by asking you a question. Maybe then we can take a few questions because there are a lot of people that sent things. So I'll ask.
Sorry, I'm not reading اليوم إيه لأنه it's like right above my face كل اللي عم يعملوا comment.
I saw like a bunch of questions. But let me ask you one more thing. Beyond what we do for a living, which is the art of persuasion and narration, whatever, trying to maybe correct things, trying to revise, trying to engage, trying to learn, podcasting, writing, free expression. I think talking for the sake of talking is over, and I think problem solving in a real way is needed. And I don't know if there's more than we can do. I think some of us do this in unique ways, but I don't know if there's more that can be done without reaching that red line. So do you see any wiggle space so that our voices are maybe more action related rather than just venting all the time.
For the part of if people could be doing more, I don't like to go down that road because we can never know people's own struggle and their own lives. So I cannot expect someone to do more than whatever they're willing to do. So if you've noticed over the years, a lot of rhetoric بيطلع وين الناس اللي ما بينزلوا ليه. I never used that rhetoric ever. I'm like نحن هون إذا بدكم تعالوا, because no one knows what each person is going through, what their struggles, how their choices are. وفي ناس خي ما بدها عباله يروح يسهر وينبسط ويروح على عيشتي وهيك حقه. This is how a free society should work. But could we be doing better? أكيد. Is it as fast as I would like it to be? أكيد لا. It took us 2 years نعمل coalitions ننزل انتخابات وعلى نص إجر وبرضه we did that well. Imagine إذا كل السابوتاج جربوا يعملوا الممانعة على this attempt وبقاي 14 أصدار وكلهم يعني كاتب. Imagine if that didn't happen, how much better we would have been prepared for the elections. And despite that, we exceeded all expectations. So could we do better? 3000 مليون بالمية we can. بس ما بينا نفكر. نسيت مين قال لي, صار لي يومين عم جرب اتذكر, بس they told me something كثير حبيتها, انه اليوم عندك سلوغن مثل نايكي just do it. اوكي بس نايكي بس بدها تعمل بوت ما بيقول just do it, بيعمل بوت. بيجيبوا تيم chemical engineers, بيجيبوا architects, بيجيبوا industrial designers, بيجيبوا حكمة كل شيء to actually design this. So they didn't just do it. كلهم is just do it طبعا. So اليوم كلهم everyone can get behind it واحنا we believe in it انه لازم كلهم. بس اليوم بعد نشوف شوية هيك accounts كانت active بالثورة انه ليه ما جبت سيرة وئام وهاب كمان؟ كون انا عم بحكي عن شيء له علاقة مثلا بين الحزب والعونية انه this need انه كيف ما سكرت هيدا؟ ليش ما قلت كتائب هون؟ ما بال 1808. This is not what the reality is اليوم انا ما في حدا خايفين الكتائب يقتلوه ببيته مثل بالايتيز. اليوم خايفين من الحزب to do that and they are. So this ability when it just do it صارت how we operate failed miserably. وكل هالقرطة اللي راحوا كتير سوبر منفذ look how they did in the elections. Absolutely horrible. لأنه people aren't stupid. كلهم is our guiding principle, بس it's not how we do work. اليوم أنا إذا لقيت واحد بركي يقدر يعمل شيء صح وهو جادج معينه نبيه بري ولأنه مساقبة قطع واحد I can convince him إنه to rule the right way I should do that. مش بقول له لا أنا ما بدي هيك وأنت هيدا وبالآخر يطلع القضاء ضدي. So هيدا what I think a lot of people are having trouble with, transitioning from الشارع وال lack of nuance completely, black and white تبع الشارع into the reality. يوم بيرني ساندرز وجو بايدن بنفس الحزب technically وبيشتغلوا سوا, بس their ideas could not be more opposite. بس اليوم إذا أنا بدي أقطع قانون على ذوقي, شوف كيف بدي أقطع أنا وبايدن وبركي بجيب شوية Republicans معه. Not to give here as an example to follow يعني إنه هيك outright, بس just do it. كلهم can't be how we live our lives. نحن مش شغلتنا نتظاهر. أنا ما كان حلمي إنه ضل قاعد بالشارع آكل خبيط وتيرجس وهيك. No one wants to do that. This is something because you have nothing else to do. واليوم وقت حدا يعمل شيء مش عجبني من يلي عن جماعتنا, بدي أشوف كيف بدي to figure out كيف فينا to come together on that. This is how we could do better, I think. إذا من فيلم إنه كلهم is our Bible into thinking it's like our nice slogan that we use, but each policy decision, each sector, we get people شغلتهم شاطرين بيعرفوا to lay it out, and then we see كيف معقول نقدر نشتغل عليها. That goes into the thing you said إنه شو بدنا نعمل 16 MP 100%. بس إذا تطلع على الحزب وضد الحزب traditional, it's a razor thin line بيناتهم. So نحن فينا نقرر مين بيربح. نواف سلام was a good example. لو القوات ما راحوا مع الحزب وصار قال even though they named him هلا قبل هلا قال لا اللي ما بيعرفوا ما راح name him to derail that to help keep in place النظام هو. بس لو they did fall in line مع البقية كنا طلعنا نواف سلام بدل السبير دولاب تبع. وعملت example كان نواف سلام مش إنه supporting him على الآخر ولا. That's not even what we're talking about. But we could have thought more tactically in this and won that thing instead of بس نحط دولاب سبير تبع حزب الله نجيب مئات. واذا بنضل نفكر هيك رح يضلوا هن يعملوا شو ما بدنا ونحن نعمل بيانات ونزعل. بس we have a really good chance to make it more into a methodology versus بس انه a nice slogan. كلنا بنحب slogans، كلنا بنحبهم. another thing كمان كتبت عنها is قد ايه نحن we attack each other. هلا بعرف انه انا من بعض السؤال على الشات people will do that about it. بس in the run up للانتخابات انتبه الاتاكس يلي كان على ناس supposedly لازم يكونوا نفس الجروب were a lot more intense than those ضد يلي نحن we're supposed to dethrone. فذات when not every battle is an existential one. إذا أنت عملت شيء أنا ما عجبني راني مش ضروري يكون أنا وياك mortal enemies للموت و no way وبلا بلا بلا. This is something I'm guilty of وأنا بعترف إنه a lot of people أنا أكست لهم من ورا شيء ما اتفقنا عليه. In retrospect بركي that wasn't the ideal thing. فاليوم إذا حدا ما بحسه عن جد threat على الآخر I pick my battles wiser. ليه؟ لأن ما بدك تصرف انرجي على كل هالقصص وبالاخر بنضل 4-5 نحن عم نعمل security test لحالنا اذا نحن عن جد كلهم يعني كلهم ولا لا. وهيدا ما بوصلنا للهدف والبقيه عم يعملوا everything. فكلهم يعني كلهم absolutely forever. بس كيف بدك تطبق هذا الشيء؟ اليوم اذا ما خصوا مثلا مثلا اذا العونيه ما خصوا ابدا بسيكتور معين ضروري انا فوتهم دائما بهذا السيكتور. هذا مستلمين الكهرباء اكيد I'm gonna attack them. بتقول لي انه ايه بس بال 92 مدري كم وزير. What does that matter? It's not like a scale when نحن بدنا نتاكد انه اذا انا حكيت عن 14 بدي احكي عن 8. ما في 14 وما في 8 في حزب الله والسلطه يلي تحته. The quicker we see that and focus كيف بنصير نعرف اليوم بوكس لحزب الله في يكون فيها اكس 14 ازار يلي ماشيين معه اوقات في يكون ضد العونيه مرات ثانيه. بس the ability وين انا مكبل حالي وعم مجلد حالي على الفاضي كل الوقت لانه انا I'm holding myself to this ideal وقت الرياليتي ما عم يصير بدي اياه. ونحن بالنهايه شو بدنا؟ بدنا to get results ما بدنا to نسجل مواقف بس.
What worries me, and I'll wrap it up with this, and maybe we can take just a few questions. What really worries me is that you mentioned Nawaf Slam, and it could be anyone like him, but let's say...
As an example, nothing against him, أكيد. I think he's definitely better than Miati.
Let's use him because he's in the discussions always. So Nawaf Slam, I fear that should he become prime minister, if he actually became prime minister, and if he did something that was serious to rebuilding the Lebanese state under these circumstances, he'd be either kicked out of the country again, like Saad Hariri was kicked out several times, sometimes on his own decisions, but other times he actually left the country and would be beaten up abroad. I can't imagine Nawaf Slam coming out cleaner than that. And let's say none of us want Saad Hariri to ever return. But I think if Nawaf Slam acted...
I don't think he does,
I don't think he does either. But let's say Nawaf Slam, if he did something that was really dramatically different than Najib Miati, he'd be part of our history. And I gave this analogy to Paul Najjar. And it was maybe an inappropriate time to do it, but I thought it was good to have this flushed out a bit. It was right before the elections. I think if Paul Najjar was president of Lebanon, forget Michel Aoun, Paul Najjar is in Ba'abda the last 6 years. Had he tried to prevent ammonium nitrate from entering the port in a serious way,
exactly.
Removed from Ba'abda, no longer president, or paralyzed in power. And that to me, I think, is the burden that I think intelligentsia could at least help explain better. Because if we're able to frame the problem as one of security and one of diplomacy that includes politics and corruption and sectarian reform and all of that stuff, I think we'd be able to deliver at least the problem better. Because I worry over time, the good people that are trying are increasingly afraid. The bad guys have multiple ways to deliver their message, and the gray zone in between should not be dictating politics either. So I worry that maybe we're losing this battle slowly, and I'd like us to win this battle. I prefer that we're the winners in this.
Slowly but surely is mine. Well, I think it's a problem that a lot of the Lebanese public kind of understood لان احنا معودين انه عادة one significant thing happens وبعدين كل شيء بيتغير. You gave Doha as an example. So in people's minds هن معودين انه دائما في مثل انه بكره بعد الانتخابات الامريكيه بيمشي الحال. بكره وقت ينقوا رئيس الوزراء تبع فرنسا بيمشي الحال. بكره بس يخلصوا الايران توكس بيمشي الحال. لان احنا معودين هيك ونشرات الاخبار كلها هيك والداي تايم تي في شوز اللي بيجيبوا لي سالم زهران وما ادري شو ما بيحكوا غير عن المواضيع. So in people's mind this is a reality when it is not. No one cares about that. It's always incremental change شوي شوي. اكيد بيجي خضات اوقات مثل اكتوبر 17 ما في يقول هذا شيء incremental لان طريقه الناس والايديا of what accountability is to them changed forever. ما رح ترجع مثل قبل. هلا ما بقى فيك مثل قبل تعمل ضربيات هالقد رح تحس حالك غلط وحدا رح يقول وينك كذا مزا. So I think people realize that مثل انه فكروا انه اذا بينطروا سنتين ثلاثه مصرياتهم بالبنك بيرجعوا ناو كلهم اتفهموا انه مصرياتهم طاروا. ف it's taking us time لانه a lot of us just need this glimpse of hope انه it's all gonna end. هلا a good example of that is النفط. ضلوا يقولوا لنا ايه خلص هيدي حلت لنا مشكله وما بدنا اي ام اف وبلا بلا بلا. حبيبي اول شيء not proven. حكيت مع لوري هايتايان about this. 2 it will take us so long to do it. 3 ولا بلد متخلف مثل لبنان الدوله تبعه استفاد من النفط تبعه. ولا دوله استخرجت نفط وهي مش ماشيه السيستم تبعها actually استفادت كيرس لاغلبيتهم. Venezuela is a good example. Nigeria is another. في so many places قبل ما النظام يكون ظابط oil hurt them. It didn't help them. It polluted them. Corruption زاد. Brazil is a good example كمان شفنا شو كانوا يعملوا بالكار واتشات وهيك. So بدهم هيدا الفالس هوب وبتكبشوا فيه مثل كان هيدا هو الصح. بس I think 17 أكتوبر وبعد 8 4 آب و8 آب they're a lot more pragmatic in that and they know إنه إذا إجا نواف سلام مش إنه فجأة رح يزبط البلد. I think هالacceptance مش الحل عند الناس. السؤال كيف how to address it. I think كل واحد بيعمل شاطر فيه. يعني as you're a good chemical engineer مثل نجاة صليبة فوكس لي على كيف أنا بدي ما موت من كانسر لأنه في 50 موتور بالحي عندي وكل السيارات من الثمانينات وبيمشوا على غاز ما بعرف شو. I will get hurt يجري بدي حدا يفسر لي شو بدي أعمل لأي ام اف. بجيب حدا بيفهم بالفاينانس تبعه الأساس يفسر لي خيي شو لأنه no one is an expert بكل شيء. عنا ف it's all incremental change وحتى لو اجى نوصل مثل ما قلت nothing will change واذا كان خطر عليه بيطيروه like they usually do. So it has to be change اللي شوي شوي وين توصل لبوينت وين حزب الله بيوعى بيقول ايه ما بقى في اعمل شيء. But that doesn't happen overnight or with one election. And I think we're already on that path and we're doing great بهذا الباث. بس it's what تطلع يوم day to day it's easy to fall into despair. And I think that's where مهم ندور على قصص يلي ما لفت نظري. ما حدا بيحكي عن انتخابات البلديه ما بعرف ليه. I'm really trying hard to focus on that لانه انا من صغرته I grew up thinking انه نحن عنا زعيم عائله وبس هو اللي بيطلع النايب وبلا بلا بلا وكذا. وكامبينينج لميشيل دويهي وشمالنا وكلهم ما بتتخيل قد ايه كان الريزيستنت انه انتوا هلا بصغرتك بتطلعوا نايب وكل هو عرفت always that derogatory انه لك هول اولاد وشو مبسوطين وكذا. طلع ميشيل دويهي ما طلع زعيم العائله that's supposed to. هلا وقتها صاروا كلهم شو مبروك اهلا بس it did happen in a place يعني اللي ما انه من صغرتها ما عندكم فكره قد ايه الناس conservative فوق يعني حتى males females بيسمون وقت العزاء it's not liberal bastion of progressive ideas. بين هذا الشيء انه غلط. The younger generation من عمرنا كان في كثير منهم و they were able to pull off something that ليه عم نحكي عنها specifically لانه I know it enough. My own town, my own relatives, my own هيدا. Something huge happened and it was too late for them to notice. هن مفكرين انه هو يطلع ماكسيموم بياخد واحد اكسترا معود او بياخد واحد اكسترا فنجي. And then it happened. They need to figure out what to do now. فهلا صار mentality تبعهم change with that. ف how did that happen? Who would have expected إنه ميشيل دويهي يربح? Even I deep down بركي didn't. ليك شو صار because of this incremental change يلي كان grassroots led. كان grassroots led. توني هلا عملت comment because of people like her يدقوا باب يحكوا كذا. It happened even though أنا ما بحياتي كنت أفكر وليه عمل لك when I was 15 16 روح على غدوات وعشوات العائلة. We even have a flag للعائلة و coat of arms والزعيم بلا بلا بلا. That فرنجي زعيم فرنجي شو اسمه ده. for this to change الالي كان a seismic shift انه even بصغرتها معقول يعني it's not just the intellectual cafes طبعا حمرا blah blah blah. It was also the rural parts where we were able to do well. فهيدي الايديا انه no way خيي يطلع لي نايب من اصل كليتي احسن ما يكون عندي صفر نايب for me. كيف بدي اجيب تاني نايب next time؟ انا هيك بدي افكر. And if we do that enough time وحزب الله بيضل هالقد محشور وعم يصرف مصاري بسوريا وبالعراق ومدري شو ايران ما عم تبعت له قد ايه بده يداين versus قد ايه نحن فينا نداين. هون بصير الذكاء تبعنا. How can we last without the safety net that Hezbollah provides to its own people? كيف نحن بدنا نعمل هالسيفتي نت؟
These two things that are happening at the same time, and I know that Sabotage Tashrim parties have already gone into the local stuff behind the scenes. I know they're talking about it all the time.
And they should. That's where they should be.
Right, so let's say that is happening anyway. That's happening naturally. And I agree with your long-term optimistic lens, which is this phase of our history will expire. And it's not a permanent reality. What I worry about, and this is again the way I see it, is that the end of this nightmare later in our lives will be an unrecognizable Lebanon that's nearly impossible to rebuild. And I wish we could create circumstances on the ground earlier that would move things in a better direction quicker. And I still hold on to this need to redress and reverse these horrible agreements made at our expense. And if we're able to do that without time travel, no one can do time travel. None of us can go back to the 1960s. Yeah, I'd like to actually move as history moves in this natural direction, but at least have that kind of diplomacy correct the mistakes of the past. Because in my lifetime, I've seen too many deals that make Lebanon an ungovernable country, and it's not Lebanon's fault.
True.
And I don't blame Lebanese for this tragedy. I don't blame them.
أنا ولا مرة أكيد.
So Gino, on that note, let's take a few questions. I can't go further up because it's, but whoever's still around and wants to ask a few questions, write them down. I saw one a few minutes ago, but it slipped, so feel free anyway.
Let me scroll a bit. I think لأن حكينا عن كل شيء شو بدي ينسأل بعد. The hot topic. The hot topic button at least.
Yeah.
بس إنه مثل ما أنت كنت عم تقول about the time machine thing إنه what we need for change to happen is there. يعني قبل ما رح نكذب بعض خلينا نكون كلنا شوي honest. البونزي سكيم يلي عملوها على البنوك استفاد منها a lot of Lebanese people. A lot of us قدرنا نروح على private university نشتري سيارات blah 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 even though it shouldn't have been possible technically. هلا وقعت الكارثة ولاحظنا it was all a lie. Do I still think إنه بركي إذا بنطر بعد سنتين ثلاثة برد لي إياهم هون ومدري شو وبسيل ولا بصير فكر أنا كيف بدي to make sure this doesn't happen again. And you're seeing that change اليوم قد إيه أنا كان حلمي يكون في solar panels على كل بيت بلبنان. It's a reality اليوم. Is it ideal؟ لا. Is it عم يسبخوا الناس for it؟ لا. Can I build upon it later on؟ وقت أنا استلم بلدية ويكون already مثلا 30% من البيوت تبعي عندهم solar panels وأنا بجيب الباقي another 30% وبالآخر بحط موتور الحي موتور هذا الجنريتور بقشطهم إياه كلهم وأنا بديره at a fixed price مش تطلع profit منه. أنا أمنت 24 ساعة كهرباء بلا ما غير قانون بلا ما أشيل غدا هون بلا ما أشيل ميشيل هون وحسن نصر الله بعده مخبى بالمجرور. It is possible to do change. The only thing stopping us from that هي إنه نحن خايفين منهم يعملوا لنا شيء إذا عملنا change. إذا ما عندنا خايفين خلي درك يسترجي على ضيعة قدرت تأمن كهرباء وقف الكهرباء. I would love to see that live.
I think of that all the time.
هذا السؤال ما بحبه السؤال جون فالجون. If you're given country leadership today, what would you do to rebuild the country? If أول شيء I'd close all the banks اللي كانوا already موجودين مسكرهم بحطهم بالحبوس لكل الناس اللي own them fresh slate يلي عنده كان كل شيء هيدا. This is the first thing I do. Second thing I do يلي بيحل كل المشاكل الباقية بعمل قانون أحوال شخصية مدنية. هيدي الفكرة إنه في 18 judiciary لكل سكتور is the reason we're in this mess. وهيدول نحن بنفكر انه هن رجال دين ومعلق most of them بيقبضوا من our taxes we fund them. انا بحق لي احكي عنهم. انا ما بدي خوري وشيخ يقرر انا حياتي شو بعمل. This can have so much impact directly وما بده شيء غير قانون واحد. It's not a systematic educational blah 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 generational thing. اليوم اذا انا في روح اتجوز مره مثلني وانا خلقت مسيحي ما بدي اروح على قبرص. ما بدي ما اعرف شو بدي اعمل. انا اذا مروني ما في يطلق اذا مثلا مش ماشي بقى الحال. This can change so much لانه الديموغرافيكس اللي هن عاملينها من ايام الحرب بتبلش شوي شوي تختفي. مش كل الناس بس تنغرم ببيئتها بس ما عندهم ability يروحوا لغير هيدا. وهون بتشيل a lot of the power الموجوده عند السلطه يلي رجال الدين بارت منها. يعني مين رجال الدين اللي بيتعينوا؟ كلهم بده يروحوا لعند يجي رئيس الوزراء اللي عندهم ويجي رئيس الحكومه بلا بلا بلا. If we remove that power منهم that would be the first thing I do فالجان لانه it's something I care about personally. انا ما بدي خوري وشيخ يقرر لي حياتي. انا ما صوتت له ومين هو تيقرر. انا بدي الجادج اكشلي بيعرف يكون انا عندي محامي معي ومحامي ضدي وتو ميك ماي كيس وخليهم يقرروا بيس على القانون. سو اذا انا بستلم ليدرشيب لبنان this is the first thing I would do. بشيل الاحوال الشخصيه من بعد ما سكر البنوك.
I'll take one question that was directed to me as well from Tonya Mura. I'd like to know, Ronnie, which moves you think will make the progress quicker? Because I am convincing myself to embrace the organic social waves. Okay, I've not been to that zone yet. The organic social waves. And I think this is an unfortunate reality in my mind. I think the long-term paralysis that defined most of Lebanon's history ends when bad deals are made. So, for example, the worst years of Lebanese history, which are the 1980s, the Civil War, the invasions, the occupation, all of that, the bloodshed, over 100,000 Lebanese lose their lives in that decade. You take it to the 1970s, it's misery for 15 years. It all ends the moment Ta'if is signed. And an agreement that is so bad for Lebanon, but it ends the paralysis. My experience with Doha was 3 struggling years of a Lebanese state trying and failing to push a few things forward. That meant institutional reform. That sluggishness, that carefulness is defined by violence as well. Doha changes things forever, and suddenly Hezbollah is a central component to our politics today. That's the way I see it. So I unfortunately would add that to the aggressive need for diplomacy that throws things in reverse. I think I know what organic social waves means. I don't know if things can naturally happen for the better given what we live under. Had it been a Lebanese affair, had Hezbollah been a Lebanese militia, the way the Lebanese forces were a Lebanese militia in the 1980s, they would be a bad political party.
ما كان باين بالبحر وكذا يعني بس they stopped calling the shots. This is what we want هلا. إيطاليا organic ببلشوا organic بس لازم يصيروا disciplined. وكريم أنت قلت about the banks. أنا ما قصدي إنه ما يقعد في banks أبداً بس the banks that were guilty in doing this like any other business they need to pay the price for it. أنا اليوم ليش بعده الشير هولدر والكذا هو عم يقبض وقت أنا مصرياتي طاروا. خلص خي أنت فشلت وكذبت ويو were corrupt. روح على بيتك أو فوت على الحبس. خلي حدا يعمل بنك تاني اللي ما بيروح بيعطيهم كلهم رياض سلامة يعطيهم إياهم للسلطة يصرفون على أساس بلا طعمة وينفعوا جماعتهم يحطون كلهم ببنما وهيك. So it's not إنه ضد البنكس يعني مثل جماعة الموينة وهيك. You need credit بالنهاية to have growth. أنا ما معي مصاري أفتح شركة بدي أروح أدعي من بنك أفتح شركة for example يعني or any of us. هيدي بس لكريم يعني مش إنه ما بدنا بنوكي أبدا بس البنوكي that were complicit in the largest Ponzi scheme ever. يعني اليوم بيرني مايدوف فات على الحبس وتعمل ما قالوا له اوكي حبيبي كمل فات على الحبس. لازم هدول كلهم يفوتوا على الحبس ويتسكروا بنوكتهم لانه if not criminals they are extremely stupid و incompetent وممنوع هن بقى يمسكوا مسؤوليات البلد.
You know what? I think I'll answer a question that was directed at you, Gino, about hope. Yeah, you do define hope in a way because you're still involved in this story from abroad. I disagree with the sentiment that when you leave this country, you're no longer part of the story. I think the reality is you can be part of it if you want to. You've proven to do that on your terms abroad. It is better to have you in this country doing this in person. But for the time being, thank you for letting me
Soon,
steal.
someday, hopefully.
Yeah, I want you back.
Someday, hopefully.
Someday. And thank you for letting me steal your Friday afternoon. I can't.
لا رامي, it's always a pleasure. دايما هيك last minute, بس I always enjoy. Today's conversation was very.
This is the Friday
Much
night I
needed.
prefer than doing anything else. So thank you again.
Technically, it's still 3:47 p.m. here, so I still
start
have my
from-
Friday night.
I'm going to do two things. I'm going to plug your. Anyone that doesn't know your podcast, check it out. BUKRA. It's long form.
You're gonna love. I'm gonna give you a scoop for the next
Yeah.
guest next week. It's gonna be a priest.
Is it?
That's all I'm gonna say.
Is it the other Jaja, Father Jaja?
No,
on
no,
Twitter?
no, no.
No.
It's an actual priest, an
Actual-
evangelical priest
Okay.
that I found, and I think it's gonna be an interesting one. It's definitely out of my league and my normal comfort zone. أنا عارف إن أنا exposing out on الخوارن, doing bad and getting shit for it, but كمان ما فينا نقول all. Not all of them are like this, and I think this young priest is we need more of, and we're gonna discuss all of these things. شو صار, the rise of religious extremism, his opinion on it, what we can do to work together, even though we disagree so fundamentally on what the world is, what our place in it is. كل هدول القصص. فهيدي سكوب لك.
I think no, that's great. You know, and by the way, I really meant it because there is a Father Jaja I follow on Twitter. It just happens to be his last name is Jaja, yeah. But it's always good that when secularists talk to sectarian-minded Lebanese, when religiously devoted Lebanese talk to civil society and the more secular-minded, I think this is the stuff I live for. So I like listening to these conversations anyway. So it's good you're doing that. And I'll also
it was a good conversation. I was happy.
Oh, good.
I was worried going into it, and I am a bit extreme. خاصة when it comes to faith stuff, I'm very open about my lack of faith. هذا الشيء is a part of how I see myself in this world وكل شيء. But if you remember George Masouh, the Orthodox priest who passed away 12 years ago from cancer, so he is one of the men I respect most. مثلا كان يقول لهم وقت جنود الرب وهيك used to do stuff, يمنعوا فيلم او ممنوع تعمل gay parade او بلا بلا بلا. كان دائما يعطيهم example انه Jesus ابن الله لالون literally was humiliated, tortured and killed and didn't do anything about it. So مين فكر حالك انت تيجي تحكي عن انه Jesus مش عاجبك اذا Jesus himself took that and told them اغفر لهم خطاياهم ما بيعرفوها بلا بلا بلا. So when he said that, I'm like, wow! من وين اجى هيدا? Because regardless شو بنفكر عن Jesus blah 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 etc. who believes about it, he hit it exactly of what kind of mentality Jesus, the actual historical Jesus, was in. وبيزعوعيا and even according to Jesus, what you're doing is absolutely wrong, and we don't have enough of these priests. So كثير زعلت بس. That's why I want to sit with him.
Hey, Gino. That's how it ends, right?
Right? Perfect timing.
That's perfect timing. I'll add something. Hearing you talking about Christianity, I never imagined that. So that's a nice development. It's a good thing. I'm going to listen to that episode. I'm really interested. I'll also just insist that people read your opinion pieces in NOWLebanon. They're recurring more often. So I like reading your. It reminds me of your blog, but a little more structured. And I love.
I wish people read more. Still read as much.
Yeah. No,
I prefer that over stories, but it's okay.
No.
But then for the people who sometimes don't like, I curse a lot, I troll people I don't agree with, you won't find that in the article. So you want the more يعني موزون opinions without the fun that we inject on social media. I'd recommend articles.
But to be fair, also even in your podcast episodes, you're fairly measured. So it's nice to have a variety of ways of tackling this conflict.
That's another thing, Ronnie. The social media's unintended effect has made everyone into a one-dimensional character. So in people's minds, when I meet someone live, مثلا أول مرة, I'm sitting, look at that fuckhead. You know, ليش يسب لك وعيط عليك يعني. If I'm meeting you, I am a normal human with that. بس اليوم being faced with everything بلبنان أقل شيء قل له كس أمك شرموطة اللي عم جرب يخبصني بنص المظاهرة. That's very normal. والهيدول اللي أول نزل على الثورة أول يومين، لا أنا نزلت أول يومين بس بعدين صاروا يجيبوا يسبوا وفليت. خي فل الله معك. اليوم الهلا هو إفكت على جبران can never be undone. إذا حطنا كلنا بالحبس وجيب حزب الله يقتلنا رح يضل كل ما تنقطع الكهرباء نقول كس امه جبران بس هي. And for me that was worth all the flack I got because there's no going back from this for them. And for me it was a political decision. ماني هيك كل وقت ما رح اقدر اسلسلكم كل وقت I like to troll people every now and then.
You're doing it on your terms, and that's the most important thing. You're an independent mind. You're figuring things out as the story evolves too. You're touching on different medium. I think you're doing just fine, Gino. So I appreciate you.
Ronnie, thank you.
No, thank you for letting me spend my Friday night with you. I'd rather do this than anything else. And we'll talk more. So, BUKRA, the podcast, NOWLebanon opinion column. Thank you, Gino.
Save the conversation. It was a nice one.
I am, and I'm going to actually, what I'll do is I'll edit it out a bit. I'll turn it into a podcast episode. So it'll be on the podcast as well. Yeah.
Amazing.
Thanks, Gino.
Ronnie, bye. Bye, everyone.